Well, I went to essentially the regular public school system up through grade school, junior high, etc. But I think that one thing that was really obvious was that my science teachers were very motivated and very dedicated to teaching students, and I became interested in science really at the junior high school level. I had some instructors who were very good. They really got us enthused about science. They essentially taught us as if we were college students. The material was not really very, I mean, it was at our level, but they sort of taught us in a way in which we sort of made our own discoveries and we got to report what we saw. And so that really made me very excited about science at a very early age. My undergraduate years were pretty easy, and then so I kind of started forcing myself to take harder and harder classes to kind of keep myself motivated. Well, my parents were very proactive in that education was important, but they made no, I guess, demands on what my career was going to be. My parents, for all the kids in the family, said, do what you want to do, just do whatever you do well. And so that was the role model that we had, is that you didn't do anything in sort of halfway. You gave everything to whatever you were going to do. And so my parents decided that, you know, whatever career we chose was fine with them. I loved school. I loved going to school. I loved my science. I was very much more interested in biological sciences than the physical sciences, though I did take advanced placement chemistry and advanced placement physics when I was in high school. So I did well in those classes. I took calculus in high school, but I really liked the biological sciences. I decided in 8th grade I was going to get a PhD. That I was going to teach in a college. So I decided that I really liked science, and I had talked to my teacher. That was my 8th grade teacher, was one who really got me interested in science, and he said, well, this is what we do in college, and this is how we teach college. I said, well, that's what I want to do. I was a good student. I don't think I was better than average, to be real honest, but I worked hard. I think that I developed a real strong work ethic from my parents. They were always working. We would take vacations and we would take time off and we would spend time together as a family. But when we weren't doing that, my parents were working and doing whatever jobs they were going to be doing. And so we learned at an early age in my family that to get anywhere you had to work hard. And you can enjoy working. Working can be fun. And so I learned that at an early age, and I learned that if I apply myself and I'm determined, that you can really make something of yourself, even if you don't necessarily think you have the innate intelligence. I mean, I don't think I got where I was today on raw intelligence. I think I got there because I'm smart enough, but I also could set a goal and reach it. I guess in the sense that when I was in college as an undergraduate, again, I was very much into biology, and at that time I was actually thinking about becoming a veterinarian as well. I do love animals, and I had thought about becoming a veterinarian, but really it was in college I decided that I wanted to be doing research. I didn't want to be essentially working with patients and clients in that respect, though I actually have a veterinarian degree as well. So I have a PhD and a DVM degree, but I wanted to use my DVM degree to further science as well and research, not clinical medicine. I kind of come through things in sort of the back way, which is probably people need to know that you don't necessarily have to have a goal in mind when you're early, very, very young, and then stick with that same goal. My early training was in invertebrate biology. I trained as essentially a biologist who was looking at insects and invertebrates. I did a lot of work with invertebrates that are found in the ocean, and all my graduate work is with Drosophila, fruit flies. But I became very interested in mammalian development and how does the brain specifically develop. As a graduate student, even though it wasn't my research, I became very interested in that topic. And so what I decided to do was, after I finished my PhD, then I went and got my DVM degree. So I essentially switched from being an invertebrate biologist to being a vertebrate biologist by earning my DVM degree. And then, while I was doing research in a laboratory there, just essentially to have a job, I became very interested in some mice that have neurologic disorders. So their brains were not forming properly. So now my research lab is all focused on how the brain develops and what happens when the brain doesn't function properly during development and also in aging. We publish usually between 2 and 3 articles a year in my laboratory. I currently have 4 graduate students in my laboratory. A 5th one's coming on probably in the fall. I also have undergraduates who work in my laboratory. I usually have 4 or 5 undergraduates doing research. I have veterinary students who work in my lab, and I also take on high school students. The work that I'm doing right now is very specifically geared towards human disease. I study mice that have neurologic disorders, and they have mutations in specific genes. So what happens is these mice have these alterations that are very specific, and humans have exact same mutations in the same genes. And so the types of diseases or conditions that my mice have are very similar to the types of conditions that people have. So we study these conditions in these mice, trying to understand what are the mechanisms, what is actually causing these disorders in these mice, in hopes that we'll be able to help humans with the same diseases. I think the work that's probably the most important right now is that we're looking at how a toxic methylmercury affects the nervous system. Mercury is a toxic chemical, a metal, heavy metal that's found in our environment. It's essentially contaminating our soil and our water, and we all are exposed to that, some in less forms and some in greater amounts. And I think that it's very important for everybody at whatever level to understand that heavy metals, and mercury specifically, is a very dangerous compound, and we need to be aware of how it affects our body and how we can avoid it, and if we do get exposed to it, how can we minimize the effects. That's the work that I'm hoping that anybody would hopefully understand. I would hope that the work that we're doing now will lead to therapies that will reduce the effects of methylmercury contamination in people. I'm hoping that the information that we find will help us to better understand, once a person takes in mercury into their body, how can we then prevent that mercury from damaging the cells in the body, specifically in the brain. Often it comes in the foods that we eat, particularly in fish. Fish tend to have a high concentration of mercury in them. Mercury is a byproduct of various types of industrial processes. It gets into our soil and water. Specifically, when it gets into water, mercury is converted by bacteria to methylmercury. Methylmercury is a form of mercury that's very easily taken up into the body when you eat it. So if it's in water that we drink, then it will get into our bodies. But usually we take it in by eating other animals that have ingested the mercury. So usually it's fish and shellfish are the most common ways that we ingest mercury. The EPA set out some rules or some regulations about 2 years ago that said that the level of mercury that we should not consume can be sometimes found in 1 can of tuna fish. So essentially, if you eat more than 1 can of tuna fish a week, you're eating more mercury than you should be. One thing is, I like the whole idea of discovery. The whole aspect of research that's so interesting is that you're finding out something that's new that somebody else never knew before. So the whole idea of discovering new information that hopefully might be useful is to me is very exciting. The other thing that I really enjoy doing is I do enjoy teaching. And so when one is doing both research as well as teaching in a classroom, but both research is teaching as well as teaching in a classroom. So I'm teaching my graduate students, I'm teaching the undergraduates who come to my laboratory. I'm constantly working with students to help them learn how to gain research skills, how does the scientific process work. So that part of training new scientists, I think, is very exciting as well. I think it's very important for students to understand that there's, first of all, there's real people behind. You read stuff in the newspapers and you get textbooks. All the information had to come from somewhere. And some people like myself are essentially out there trying to find new information and then impart it to people. But I think it's much better sometimes if you can see the person who's actually gaining that information and trying to impart it rather than just reading about it in a textbook. So I think the personal one-to-one relationship is good. And I think sometimes it's important for the students to realize that just because I'm a little bit older, in the sense I'm really not, they're not any different than I am. When I was their age, I was thinking about what I was going to be doing. They could be in my shoes in a few years. They need to realize that if they're interested in science, they like doing discovery types of things, they can be a scientist too. Well, I don't have a whole lot of spare time. I'm actually very active in my church, and so I do a lot of church work. I do some mission trips with youth, and I also am on the board of directors for Twin City Mission, so I work with the relief groups in the city as well. Really, if they have access to the internet, I think you can find out a lot of information using the World Wide Web. I think that's a tool now that we have come to rely on as a way to gain information. You have to be careful because that information isn't filtered. So you can get bad information as well as good information. But I think that's one way to do it, and I think that contacting the teachers, your own teachers, to find out more information, because they usually have resources that they can have as well. And also sometimes your counselors, the students' counselors, often can have resource information if a student is interested as well. If people don't understand where the information is coming from, and they don't really have any kind of connection with the people who are generating the information, then there's really no connect there. There's not an understanding of how that information is gathered, and the fact that scientists are just people too, and that we're essentially all in this together. So that we need to be really sharing information both ways. What is information we have? What questions do people have? What kinds of things do people want to know that we're not looking for right now, that people maybe we should be working on? So I think communication needs to be both ways. We need to be providing information to the community, and the community needs to be providing information to us, telling us what their concerns are and what they want to learn more about.